Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Amateur Radio Technician class, session number 15. When we take a look at our curriculum, we notice that we are at the last topic under the technician class program. So apart from today, we probably have one more teaching session to complete the entire syllabus. Our previous class, we looked at the Echolink system. We talked about what are nodes. We discussed how to access IRLP and the associated DTMF. We discussed what a gateway was, who the FCC is, and we looked at part 97 of the rules. We discussed the purpose of amateur radio. We also looked at what are beacons and space stations. We had a little extra in the last class where we pointed out that the ISS crossband repeater was active. We discussed harmful interference. We also looked at what a volunteer frequency coordinator is. We discussed improper frequency usage, and we talked about what are the allowed frequencies and modes. We looked at the 6-meter band, the 2-meter band. We talked a bit about transmit frequency and band edge, and I have a slide to just go over something a bit. We looked at the 1.25 meter band. We talked about the HF phone privileges that are available to the technician class operator. And we looked at CW only privileges in the VHF, UHF part of the spectrum. And in respect of the no nonsense guide, we ended on page 78. So class participant Kaz made mention of something that I thought would be useful to pass on to the class. This was when we were talking about, how to improve the reliability of messages passed, and we had talked about using the phonetic alphabet to spell words that may be unclear. So Kaz indicated that an additional very important technique used by reactors, and certainly should be used by amateur radio operators, is message confirmation. What that is the person receiving the message should repeat back the message to the sender to ensure that the correct message was in fact received. All right, so that's message confirmation, and we thank Kaz for his contribution. All right, so this is one of the slides that I made an adjustment to. This part of the slide here, we were talking about band edge. And this is a better diagram to illustrate the band edge. So what we had said is, as hams, when we're programming our radio and we know the frequency limits that we assigned as amateur radio operators, we should not program our radio, this frequency display, we should not program it to the exact edge of the band. And the reason is for this. If we have, let's say, the 20-meter band that goes from 14.00 to 14.35 megahertz, that's the edges, the lower edge and the upper edge. If we were to program our frequency to 14.00 and we switch to lower sideband, we notice that our signal will be below 14.00, which is not proper. That will be illegal operation. So that is one of the main reasons why you should not use the edge of any band to program your radio on that frequency, because you may risk operating outside of your band. So this diagram here hopefully is a little clearer than the previous diagram to show the frequency band edge and what happens if you go, let's say, for example, lower sideband, you're outside of your band. If you're on upper sideband, well, okay, you might still be within your band, but just to avoid that situation that you might have the selector incorrectly set, don't do it. Make sure you do not set it to be exactly the edge of any amateur radio band or subband. Also, we did this slide, but I inadvertently missed the next slide. So I'll go to the slide that we missed because it just resembles the previous slide. So this slide, the only difference between this slide and the previous slide is that we are looking at RTTY. It's RTTY, which stands for radio telephony, pronounced RTTY/data. So we just noted that the technician class operator has RTTY privileges and data transmission privileges in the 10-meter band only. All right, so notice here in red, this is where between 28 and 28.3 megahertz, that piece of the band, the technician class operator can do RTTY and data. Notice you can also do CW and so on, right? But for the exam question, they will ask you what part of the HF spectrum can a technician class operator operate RTTY and data, and the answer is 10-meter band only. Notice that there's no RTTY in any of the other HF bands that we have listed here. So you need to learn that and memorize that. And the slide that came after was this one. We don't need to go over this slide, but I'm just showing you this slide that I quickly glossed over inadvertently, all right? So let's go with a couple new slides. We will switch to the question pool, tackle the question pool, and then we'll come back to some more slides. All right. All right, so power, transmit power or transmitter power. We need to know that for the technician class operator on HF, where the technician class happens to have privileges, and I put up the part of the chart here that shows where you see circled in red, is where the technician class operator has frequency privileges. Notice that in all cases, that T here is for technician. If you want to know what the N means, it means novice. That's a class that don't exist anymore. You cannot be licensed to novice. It's a grandfathered class. People who have novice before, okay, they continue. But the technician class, notice 200 watts. T again for technician, 200 watts, etc., etc. So you need to learn and know for your exam that as a technician class operator on the HF part of the band, wherever the technician might have privileges, notice that the technician doesn't have much privileges in the HF band, but they do. And therefore you need to know operating transmitted power, 200 watts or less. On VHF and above, the technician actually could run 1500 watts as appropriate. All right, so you need to learn that. Those are questions in the question pool. Somebody, probably first class or second class, who was reading ahead asked me, where do you see 1500 watts? Well, in the band plan, this 1.5 kilowatt PEP means 1,500 watts peak envelope power. So it's there, just that's why we also did conversions from watts to kilowatts and so on, right? So 1.5 kilowatts is the same as 1500 watts. So it is there in the band plan if you know where to find it. Also, we need to be familiar with the concept of primary user and secondary user. So the frequencies that are allocated to amateur radio operators, you're either allocated it as a primary operator or secondary operator, or primary user, secondary user. What that means is that if you're primary in the band, you have use of that band, and anybody else will be secondary, so that you basically have priority. Think of it that way. You are prioritized for that band. However, if you are secondary to a band, that means you have privileges, yes. But if you are secondary, it means that you have to give way basically to the primary users. In other words, you cannot cause interference to them, right? If you go on a band and you know you're secondary as an amateur radio operator and you hear some other traffic, maybe it might be commercial traffic, and they are primary, you have to give way. So these are the points here. Amateur radio operators share some bands with users from other services. Sometimes amateurs are primary users, such as the 2-meter band. And I extracted from the Trinidad and Tobago FAT, the frequency allocation table, that you can see here. It has the ITU table on the left and the Trinidad and Tobago table on the right. It's harmonized, so it's pretty much very consistent. And you can see here in the 144 to 148 band, 144 here to 148. I think I highlighted this one here, right? Yeah. So you notice the word amateur is in uppercase. That means that the amateur is primary. But if we were to look at the 70 centimeter band, part of the 70 centimeter band that hams have privileges, we are secondary, and it's represented by not uppercase, but you'll have an uppercase first letter, but the rest are lowercase. So that's how, those are little clues when you're reading the frequency allocation table, how to tell who is primary and who is secondary. Notice radio location here is in uppercase, so they are primary. Amateurs are secondary. But notice for the 2 meter band, 144 to 148, amateur is uppercase. That means amateurs are primary. So the last note here is if you are secondary, you may find non-amateur stations in those portions of the band. There may be commercial traffic, and you must avoid interfering with them because they are primary and you are secondary. Well, you will actually get this as an exam question in the question pool, but it's a fairly straightforward question. There are 3 classes of licenses for the FCC exams. Technician, which is what we are doing now. And as we introduced to the first class, there's also 2 other levels, the general class and the amateur extra class. So you just need to know there are 3 classes of licenses in the FCC. That's the US system. In Trinidad and Tobago, FYI, there's a basic, there's general, and what we call advanced. But for your exam, you need to know technician, general, amateur, extra. So some other licensing information that we need to know about. So as a FCC licensed operator, you get a license for a term of 10 years. So you will get that as a question in the question pool. So you need to learn it and know it. You get a 10-year license. Now, after you pass the exam, that means you sit the exam, whether you do it online or whether you actually go to the VEs and have an in-person exam, you will get a certificate. So you have passed the exam. And if that's your first exam, you can only operate, in the US anyway, only after the grant appears in the FCC database, what is also called the ULS, right? So online, the FCC, and I have some screenshots here just to show what it might look like. When you check the FCC's database, if you see your name with the call sign, then you can operate. Now, this is the FCC exam we're talking about. So we're talking about operating within the US. If you have to operate in Trinidad and Tobago, you would need to get a license, either maybe a reciprocal if that's permitted, or your actual local TAT license. So you will be applying for that. All right, so again, this is the FCC perspective that we are talking about here. Always remember that. All right, so every so often I will try my best to put in there a little bit of localized information for your information, right? Also, only one license may be held by one person. In other words, you cannot have 2 and 3 amateur licenses. When you sit the exam, you get 1 license. If you upgrade to another, you still have 1 license. You cannot go and sit the exam and get another license, another same amateur license anyway, right? So you cannot have 2 technician licenses, for instance, with 2 separate call signs. No, you are only allowed 1, and that's the point here. Only 1 operator primary station license grant may be held by any 1 person. All right, meaning that you only get 1 call sign. The proof of authorization that you have an FCC license is the online database. That is the proof. So that is why as soon as you see your license appear there, you can use it as an FCC licensed person. All right, you don't have to wait on anything else. Once you are in the database, you can download a copy of your license, what is called a reference copy online. No longer does the FCC really mail out those licenses. They used to in the early days, you will actually get it posted to you, but you can always now download a reference copy online. And notice that any licensed operator may select what we call a vanity call sign, all right? Once that call sign is available and you of the correct class for that particular call sign. So know that you can have a customized call sign that's called the vanity call sign. So some other licensing information. So normally call signs are issued sequentially, right? In the FCC system. But after you get that call sign, you could apply to change it to a vanity call sign. An example of a valid call sign for a technician class operator is kilo 1 X-ray, X-ray, X-ray. That's just a format to show you what a technician class amateur call sign may look like. Notice it's a little bit on the long side, all right? Note that if your license expires, your FCC license expires, there's a grace period of 2 years within which you could simply renew the license, all right? So there is a grace period so that you could renew your license. And note it's 2 years grace period. But note the next point. If your license has in fact expired, you cannot transmit. So during that grace period that we talk about, those 2 years, you cannot say, oh boy, my license expired and I have 2 years grace. That 2 years grace is only to allow you to apply to renew, but you cannot transmit. Once your license is expired, you cannot transmit. So notice that transmitting is not allowed until the FCC license database shows that the license has been renewed. So don't think that that grace period is permission to have it expire and you could still use it. No, you cannot. It will be illegal. And then there's something we call a club station or club license. So clubs, amateur radio clubs, may apply for a club station or a station license for their club, but there's a requirement. So you need to know this for the exam. The club must have at least 4 members to be eligible to apply for a club call or club station license. That is a question in your exam. 4. All right, yet some other licensing information. When you first get your license, so that you are going to do the exam, whether it's online or in the presence of the volunteer examiners, you will have to fill out some forms. You're in Trinidad and Tobago, or most of the participants in this class are in Trinidad and Tobago. We have quite a few that are outside of Trinidad and Tobago. But if you are sitting the exam in Trinidad and Tobago, you need to give a US address. All right, so that US mailing address is very important. The reason is that if for some reason the FCC sends you mail and it returns to them undeliverable, there's a consequence, right? You may face revocation of the station license or suspension of your operator license. So you need to make sure that the address that you give at the time of doing the exam, or if after you become licensed, that address is no longer available, you need to make sure that you replace it with a valid address. So it's very important in order to keep your FCC license maintained. And we have something called a reciprocal agreement, meaning that some countries, so again, we're talking about the FCC/US perspective. So there are countries that you can operate from without any specific authorization. So you could just travel there and you can operate. So maybe Germany is one of those countries, a US citizens can just travel and they can operate. There may be some restrictions depending on the source class that you're coming from. If you have a technician class, there may be some restrictions when you travel and go and operate there. We need to know for the exam that you can operate your amateur station in a foreign country only when the foreign country authorizes it. So if they do not authorize this, or there's no authorization, then you cannot. It's a simple concept. If they authorize it, you can operate. If they don't authorize it, you cannot operate. So it's actually a fairly straightforward concept, and that's actually all they ask you in the question for the technician class. Guess what? As an amateur radio operator, you can operate on a vessel, a ship. So for the FCC technician class license, you need to know, all right, we have a question coming up here. Yes, very good question, Colin. Yes, skybox addresses are allowed. So it doesn't matter what the address is. It just must be a valid address that you can receive mail on. So the answer, folks, very good question, Colin. Yes, you can give the volunteer examiners a skybox address. Just make sure you give the full address and a proper address. You do not want that mail bouncing back. I mean, it will take a little bit of a doing to rectify. So thanks for your question, Colin. And the answer is yes, you can use a skybox address in the US, one of those skybox type companies. All right, cool. Nice. So you can operate on a ship, a boat, all right? So let's go with what the theory is saying here. So as an FCC licensed amateur station, you may transmit aboard a ship in international waters, right? But note that it must be from a vessel or craft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. So if you have an FCC amateur license, as long as that ship has been registered in the United States, even though they're in international waters, yes, you can operate. All right. In Trinidad and Tobago, you also have maritime mobile privileges, but I believe there's also the requirement that you must get permission from the ship captain. You know, you need to do it in a certain way as well. You don't just go and operate. So there are maritime mobile privileges in Trinidad and Tobago. Unfortunately, you do not have aeronautical mobile privileges, in case anybody wanted to ask that question. All right, so we have some don'ts, some prohibited transmissions. Do not. All right, so the following transmissions are specifically prohibited. Indecent, or what we call obscene language. You cannot transmit that at all. That's a no-no. You cannot transmit music. There is an exception. That one exception is when it is incidental, meaning, by the way, to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communication. So there is a little exception. Sorry for not closing the brackets. So no to indecent language and no to music. Okay, so codes. So transmitting any code that obfuscates, right, big word, or obliterates or makes that transmission not transparent or cannot be decoded by someone, it's prohibited, right? So you cannot send encrypted messages as an amateur radio operator. It must be what we call clear text transmission. Any amateur operator must be able to decode it. So to the authorities, that is why you cannot transmit codes that hides the meaning of the transmission. But there's one exception. That exception is, imagine an amateur radio club or society has launched a spacecraft, right, for instance, or a radio control craft. So this is, for example, a CubeSat. Well, that is the only exception. If you have control commands or control signals to that spacecraft, you can encrypt or you can obfuscate or you can make it difficult for someone to intercept that communication and send signals. For obvious reasons, you don't want anybody to just be able to take control of your spacecraft and move it around, all right? So that's the only exception. But as hams, generally, you are not allowed to transmit what we call coded messages. Now, this is not Morse code or Q codes that we're talking about. Those are known. Notice it says well-known. If it's not published or it's not well-known, it's prohibited. So Q codes and Morse code, that is well-known, it's published. So therefore, those types of codes are allowed. But once it's not known or not published, you cannot use it as an amateur radio operator. Question. All right, so Colin, I'll have to research that question about the US military and get back to you. Unfortunately, I do not know the answer to that question. So let me just take a quick note of your question and I will do my best to research it or ask someone who is knowledgeable about the US military and that question. But thank you all the same for your question. Good question. I just don't know the answer to it yet. All right, moving along. Also, prohibited communications exchanges. So as an amateur, we can communicate with other countries, but it must be that the other countries allow you to communicate with their country, all right? So it's a subtle point, but we need to take note of it. And we also need to know that as an FCC licensed amateur operator, you are prohibited from exchanging communication from any country that has notified the ITU that it objects. So if a country X, tells ITU we object to communicating with the US or any other country, then as a ham, you cannot communicate with that country. As of the last book that I read, it said that there are no such countries at this time. All right, but that could always change, right? You know how it goes with diplomatic channels and policy and so on, right? And sovereignty. But just FYI, we're not aware of any current such restrictions for the US. Amateurs are also prohibited from being paid to operate an amateur radio station. All right, so there are some exceptions, but note that you are not to use your amateur radio license for gain or financial gain, right? You are not to be paid to operate. The exceptions are when the communication is incidental to classroom instruction, and it was a school, or as they put it here, an educational institution. So if you're using amateur radio as part of that, well, okay, you're a teacher and you're being paid, all right, fair enough. So that is in a school setting, university and so on, right? Also, another exception is you can notify other amateurs of the availability if you have equipment for sale, right? Or you want to trade with them, you can use amateur radio to do that. But it mustn't be, you know, what is normally used. You mustn't be doing that on a regular basis, right? So it is not condoned for any kind of paid operations on amateur radio. So just be aware of these two little exceptions because they will ask you those questions in the exam itself. All right, nice. So some other prohibited exchanges. So we need to know what broadcast as far as amateur radio is defined as. So broadcast is defined as transmission intended for reception by the general public. I don't believe this is a question in the question pool, but what goes afterwards, we need to know what a broadcast is, right? We say that amateur radio communications must be station to station. Communications that are permitted must be incidental for the purpose of amateur radio service, and it must be remarks of a personal character, right? So note this as well. This is another question in the question pool, right? It must be permitted. The communications that you're allowed must be incidental to the amateur radio service, right? Notice here they say personal character, meaning not commercial. You know, it mustn't be business, right? It must be personal communication. Right, so note here that amateur radio operators may not broadcast. That's why we define the broadcast, what broadcast is about, right? But there are some exceptions, like so many things, right? The couple of exceptions that we note that are in your exam are: one, where such communication directly relates to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. So remember that we dealt with that previous class as well. When life and limb is at risk, or what we call a life or death situation, well, okay, then you are permitted because you are saving a human life or protecting property, right? Such as in an emergency or disaster situation. Also, you can, another exception is when you're doing code practice, you know, doing Morse code practice, for example, on the air. Yes, you can send what we call blind transmissions or just transmissions that are of a sort of broadcast nature. So that is another little exception. You can also send what we call information bulletins. And here we come back to again, MCOMs or emergency communications. Transmissions necessary to provide emergency communications. And these are normally what we call one-way type transmissions, right? Or blind transmissions. So these are the exceptions that you need to know to the rule that says amateur radio operators may not broadcast. All right, so let us take a 2-minute break and let's see if we could cover some of the outstanding question pool items as well as some of the items that we covered today on the slide deck. So let's just take a 2-minute break and see you back shortly. Okay, everyone, welcome back. So, given that we dealt with these following questions in the slide deck, previous class, and we went through quite a number of slides today as well, we will just go through these questions in the question pool, but we will try to do so with a little bit of pace, given that we took care of the theoretical aspects of it. Right, so we under the rules and regulations part of the course. Let's go straight into the questions. Which agency regulates and enforces the rules for the amateur radio service in the United States? And previous class, we learned that was the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. Right. Next question. And just before going into the next question, I will remind us that there is a question number after each question. So you notice T1A01 or Tango 1 Alpha 01, that's the question number. So if you're looking at the question pool itself and want to find that question and you're doing a control find on the PDF, you can type this in or copy and paste it and you will find the full question in the question pool. And you will see the distractors as well, the 3 additional answers that are wrong. All right. So of course we are doing the no nonsense guide, which only deals with the correct answers. But for your own interest, you may want to look at what the wrong answers are. So how you find the question in the question pool is via the question number that appears after, in brackets, all of the questions. All right. So just a little tip. Right. Moving right along. Which of the following is a purpose of the amateur radio service as stated in the FCC rules and regulations? Remember we had looked at 5, what the purpose, and there were 5 of them. Well, they only want to know about 1 of them in the exam, right? So that one is, purpose is advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. Very important aspect of amateur radio. Okay, what is the FCC Part 97 definition of a beacon? Right, so what is a beacon? It's an amateur station transmitting communications for the purposes of observing propagation or related experimental activities. Right, so hams listen for those beacons, and if they hear the beacon, they conclude, all right, there's good propagation between where the beacon is and where I am. And there are beacon stations all around the world, and you just have to tune to the frequency. And if you hear them, that is a conclusion. We have good propagation from that location to my location. Next question. What is the FCC Part 97 definition of a space station? A space station is an amateur station located more than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. So that's what a space station, more than or greater than or higher than 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Right. Right, so a trick question. When is willful interference to other amateur radio stations permitted? When can you do it? The answer is at no time. Cannot do it. All right. Moving right along as to how frequencies, repeater frequencies are assigned. Which of the following entities recommends, transmit, or receive channels and other parameters for auxiliary and repeater stations? So let's dissect this question a little bit. So they're asking you which entity or which of the entities recommends, transmit, and receive channels or frequencies and other parameters. Huh? So parameters simply another word for saying settings, other settings for auxiliary stations and repeater stations. So if you recall, we did that in a slide deck slide. that is undertaken by volunteer frequency coordinators recognized by local amateurs. Remember we said in Trinidad and Tobago that function is performed by the local authority, the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, TAT. But in the US, it's done by a volunteer frequency coordinator, all right? Now, who selects the frequency coordinator? Well, it would be amateur operators in either a local or regional area whose stations are eligible to be repeater or auxiliary stations, right? So those are the persons who either have or want to have a repeater station or auxiliary station. They're the ones who vote or select the frequency coordinator. All right, let's move along. All right, so we're on page 81 of the No Nonsense Guide, if anyone is following. So we talked about the ITU. What is the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU? It is a United Nations agency for information and communications technology, also known as ICT, right? Issues. All right, so this is where that frequency chart that we looked at, and what is VHF, what is UHF, what is 6 meter band, and so on. This is where this knowledge comes in. So you could learn this, but certainly you will have a reference point as to why these are the correct answers, right? Which frequency is within the 6 meter amateur band? 52.525 megahertz would be the correct answer, right? Because 52.525 falls within the frequency range of the 6 meter band. Similar question, which amateur band are you using when your station is transmitting on the frequency of 146.52 megahertz? What band is that? That's the question. If you recall, the 2 meter band is between 144 and 148 megahertz. So therefore, this is 146 point something megahertz. So therefore, this is between 144 and 148. And if 144 to 148 is the 2 meter band, the answer then becomes 2 meter band. So that's why knowing where the what frequency ranges the 2 meter band and the 6 meter band and so on comes in. Once you know that range, nobody could tie up with any question. All right, which should you not set, or sorry, I say again, why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of an amateur band or subband? Well, we dealt with it last class, and we also rehashed it a little bit with an updated diagram today, right? So all of these answers are correct. These are all the reasons why you should not set your transmit frequency display to the edge, the exact edge of your band. You have the privilege there, but you should not set it to that because you need to allow for calibration error in the transmitter frequency display, right? You also, so that the modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the band edge. Remember the diagram I showed you today? If we are at 14.000 and you select lower sideband, guess what? The frequency, that sideband is below 14.000. It's going to be 13.9 something, all right? So that's why you do not set your frequency to the exact edge of the subband. And one more reason, you need to allow for transmitter frequency drift, which can happen with your transmitter. So don't put it at the edge because your transmitter might have drifted a little bit and you think you are within your band, but guess what? Your transmitter is out. That is your responsibility. So again, don't do it. All right. Moving right along. What is the limitation for emissions on the frequencies between 219 and 220 megahertz? So we had a slide on that the previous class, and the slide told us that the only thing that you can transmit or supposed to be transmitted there is what we call fixed digital message forwarding systems only. Right? So those who might be familiar with things like digipeaters and APRS, that may fall into what is a fixed digital message forwarding system. But you just need to learn that for this question, right? For that band, all right? Only fixed digital message forwarding systems. Next question. On which HF bands does a technician class operator have phone privileges? So let's dissect this question. So they're asking us about HF bands. They're also asking us about a technician class operator, not a general, not an extra. The HF band, not VHF, not UHF, HF band, technician class operator, and the next most important keyword, phone privileges. And remember, when we talk about phone, phone is just another way to say voice, meaning that we're talking. So anytime you hear an operator say, I'm operating phone, that means that they're talking or there's speech involved, voice. That is what phone means. So HF band, technician class operator, phone privileges, right? According to our slide, the only place that a technician class has phone privileges in the HF band is in the 10-meter band only, and a specific area of it too, right? Now, notice that is the United States of America, USA, FCC, not in Trinidad and Tobago. The basic class does not have any HF privileges. All right. Which of the following HF bands have frequencies available to the technician class operator for RTTY or radio teletype and data transmissions? Well, we did that, we looked at it today because I'd skipped this slide the last class. Again, the answer is the same band, 10-meter band only. All right, cool. All right, so another question. Which of the following VHF, UHF frequency ranges are limited to CW? So let's dissect this question. So we're talking about VHF and UHF, and we're talking about CW. So we have a slide that says these are the frequencies in the VHF or UHF, but these are actually VHF frequencies. So these are the only frequencies that you're allowed to do CW on, or rather CW only in this part of the band, 50.0 megahertz to 50.1 megahertz, and 144.0 megahertz, or sorry, 144.0 megahertz to 144.1 megahertz. Those frequency ranges are where you can do only CW in that part of the band. All right. Next question. So again, we covered all of these on the slide deck, so we're just running through a relatively fast pace. What is the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using their assigned portions of the HF bands? So we did that today, but let's dissect the question. They have a way of trying to tie you up and asking the question in a very fancy way. The question is, what power can a technician class use on HF? That's what they're asking. You know, this is a peak envelope power output and so on, right? So let's dissect it. Maximum PEP or maximum peak envelope power. So the question here is asking about power. What power? But for what class? The technician class. What band? HF band. And as we did it today in the slide deck, as we showed on the band plan, 200 watts is what a technician class is allowed on the HF band where they have privileges. Next question. Except for some specific restrictions, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for technician class operators using frequencies above 30 megahertz? So let's dissect that question. We did that in a slide today. So they're asking us again, what's the power? All right? They're making it sound fancy by telling you about the maximum peak envelope power. But they're asking us about the power, maximum power. For a technician class operator, what frequency? Above 30 megahertz. So below 30 megahertz is HF and so on, and above 30 megahertz is VHF and so on, VHF, UHF and so on. And the answer is 1500 watts or 1.5 kilowatts. All right, let's continue. More questions. All right. Which of the following is a result of the fact that the amateur radio service is secondary in all or portions of some amateur bands, such as portions of the 70 centimeter band. Let's dissect this question a little bit. They're asking us about amateur radio service being secondary, either in all or some of an amateur radio band. What is the consequence or result of the fact that hams are secondary in some bands? What does that, in other words, what does it mean to say that a ham or an amateur operator or amateur radio is secondary on some band? What does it mean when you are secondary? It means this. US amateurs may find non-amateur stations in those portions and must avoid interfering with them, right? So that is what it means when you are secondary, as opposed to primary. Right, moving right along. For which license classes are new licenses currently available from the FCC, right? So there are only 3 license classes that if you apply for or sit exams for, you can get now as an amateur: technician, general, and amateur extra. You will hear about other things such as novice and advanced class. We're talking about the US here, right? You will hear about other classes, but those are grandfather classes. You cannot get them anymore. So these are the 3 that you need to learn for your exam: technician, which is what we are doing right now. There's general, and there's amateur extra. What is the normal term for an FCC issued primary station operator amateur radio license grant? Well, we said you get a license for 10 years. How soon after passing the exam for your first amateur radio license may you operate a transmitter on an amateur radio service frequency? So you're now doing the exam for the first time, maybe the technician class. How soon after can you use the radio or operate the transmitter? As soon as your operator/station license grant appears in the FCC license database. In other words, you have to go online and see your name and your call sign there. And once it's there, you can operate. How many operator/primary station license grants may be held by any one person? In other words, as an individual, how many amateur licenses can you have? The answer is 1. Therefore, you can only have 1 call sign. All right. What is proof of possession of an FCC issued operator prime? Maybe I should back up here. This means 1 call sign in the United States. You may get a license in another country as well, but it's only 1 license that you get in that country. All right. So when we say 1 license, it don't mean that you have a license in the US and you cannot get 1 in Trinidad and Tobago. It doesn't mean that. Just in case anyone was wondering, all right? Out of an abundance of caution. Right. Sorry, coming back to it. The question, what is proof of possession of an FCC issued operator/primary license grant? What is your proof? The control operator/primary station license must appear in the FCC ULS consolidated license database. That is simply saying, go online on the FCC ULS site and it must appear there. That is your proof that you have a license. Okay, we still have a few minutes again to go, so let's continue with the questions. We did all of these in the theory on the slide deck. Who may select a desired call sign under the vanity call sign rules? In other words, who can get a vanity call sign? The answer is any licensed amateur. You can apply for a vanity call sign, right? Or customized call sign. Next question. Which of the following is a valid call sign for a technician class amateur radio station? Well, it will look something like this. Kilo 1, X-ray, X-ray, X-ray. That is what a technician class call sign will look like. Notice it's a little bit on the long side. All right, next question. What is the grace period following the expiration of an amateur license within which the license may be renewed? The grace period is 2 years. If your license has expired and is still within the allowable grace period, may you continue to operate a transmitter on amateur radio service frequencies? Let's dissect this. What they're saying is your license is expired, but you're still within the 2-year grace period that you could go and renew the license. But note, your license has expired. They want to know, can you operate your transmitter while it's expired? The answer is no. Transmitting is not allowed until the FCC license database shows that the license has been renewed. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following is a requirement for the issuance of a club station license grant? All right, so we're talking about a club station. And we're talking about requirements. What's the requirement for a club station? To get a club station license, the club must have at least 4 members. So just need to learn that, 4 members. What may result when correspondence from the FCC is returned as undeliverable because the grantee, that is you, failed to provide and maintain a correct mailing address with the FCC. In other words, you moved or your address moved and you didn't update it. Or when you applied for the license, you made a mistake on the form. So they have a wrong license. What's the consequence of that? You can have a revocation of the station license or suspension of the operator's license. So that is why you need to, they make the point here, should you move, you must inform the FCC of your new mailing address. All right. Yep, still have a few minutes again. So let's continue with the questions. When are you allowed to operate your amateur station in a foreign country? When? Well, you can when that foreign country authorizes it. As simple as that. At least for the technician class question, all right? Next. From which of the following locations may an FCC licensed amateur station? Okay, I'm seeing a question here. Let me just deal with it one time. 1 second. Okay, so they were referring to, thanks for the question, Anthony. They were referring to space communications, and incidental normally means that it's not the primary intention, right? Incidental, it's not the main focus of the transmission. It just happens to have music along with that space station communication, all right? Under the Q&A for next class, I will come back and probably answer it in a little more comprehensive manner, but very good question, Anthony. Thank you very much. Let's take a note so that we can deal with it on the Q&A. All right. From which of the following locations may an FCC licensed amateur station transmit? The answer is, remember we had a slide with a ship? All right, so it's from any vessel or craft located in international waters and documented or registered in the United States. So that craft must be registered or documented in the US, and it could be in international waters, and you can operate using your FCC license on that ship. Okay, so we're now on to page 86 of the No Nonsense Guide. All right, and this might actually answer the question, and we might spend a couple of minutes here, Anthony, to explore your question a little bit further, right? Which of the following, sorry, reading the wrong page. What, if any, are the restrictions concerning transmission of language that may be considered obscene or indecent? We said that any such language is prohibited. Obscene or indecent language is prohibited. In other words, you cannot cuss and carry on and you know, get on. Yes, no. Prohibited. All right, so coming to Anthony's question. Under what condition is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using phone emission? All right, so remember phone is voice, right? And they're saying that the exception is when incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communication. So in other words, I could think of it as, okay, the ISS is manned spacecraft, and you have an astronaut that is, let's say, transmitting greetings for Christmas, right? And he's saying, okay, greetings to all hams in Trinidad and Tobago, or in the United States, or where else we have students? Barbados, Grenada, right? So if you are hearing that, and there happens to be some music, he has a radio on in the background, playing his favorite tune, it might be Christmas music, right? That music is incidental to his transmission. He's really telling you greetings and this season and all the best and so on, and in the background. So that is what is meant by incidental. It's not the primary. In other words, he's not broadcasting music. It's incidental to his retransmission from a spacecraft, right? So I would think of it as maybe background music, or it happens to be in the background. That's how I'll think of it, as incidental. Okay, cool, Anthony. Right, I see thumbs up there, so we're on the same page. And very good question, huh? Very good question. Really appreciate it. All right, so let's move on. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to hide their meaning? Right? Remember we said hams should not do that, but there's an exception. So the when is only when transmitting control commands to space stations or radio control craft. So if your signal, your amateur signal is what is controlling that spacecraft or radio control craft, well, yes, you can obfuscate or hide or encrypt, well, have it such that, you know, it's not plain text or clear text, right? Or you have it encoded in such a way that the meaning is hidden only for those purposes. Otherwise, as a ham or an amateur, you cannot. Let's see if we could run a couple more questions quickly. With which countries are FCC licensed amateur radio stations prohibited from exchanging communications? Well, it's any country whose administration has notified the ITU that it objects to such communication. So once they do that, you cannot communicate with them. Okay, here's the, right, so it is in this book as well. Currently, there are no countries that US amateurs are prohibited from contacting, all right? And they say currently, that can change. All right. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating that station? In other words, compensation means payment. When the communication is, here's this word again, incidental to classroom instruction at an educational institution. So university or secondary school or the like. It's incidental, meaning it's not the primary focus. So that's a case where, you know, there can be some compensation. As a teacher, you're compensated for teaching, all right? But other than that, as a ham, you may not be compensated or paid, receive compensation for operating your station, right? In other words, it's a very noble undertaking, giving back freely and willingly to society and the community. All right, when may amateur radio operators use their stations to notify other amateurs of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? All right, so when can you advertise that you have equipment for sale? Well, it is when the equipment is normally used in an amateur station and such activity is not conducted on a regular basis. In other words, I cannot come on the air and every time I am transmitting, I'm advertising a Yesu or an ICOM or Kenwood radio for sale and so on. It must be maybe occasional, every now and again. All right, I have a radio I wish to upgrade, I will sell it. But it cannot be that every time I'm on the air, I'm spending an hour advertising 50 radios and 25 microphones. No, 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 that's commercial, right? So please, as a ham, always bear that in mind. Discretion is important. What is the meaning of the term broadcasting? So actually it is a question in the question pool. I couldn't recall. So yes, so we did define what broadcasting is. What is the meaning of the term broadcasting in the FCC rules for the amateur radio service? Well, broadcasting is transmission intended for reception by the general public. Under which of the following circumstances are amateur stations authorized to transmit signals related to broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means is available? Under which condition can you do that? Only when such communication directly relates to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. In other words, life and limb, all right? People are in danger, you could save a life. That's the only circumstance. Makes sense, huh? All right. Under which of the following circumstances may an amateur radio station make one-way transmission? Well, we dealt with that in the slide deck. When transmitting code practice, meaning you're doing Morse code and you're just practicing sending, information bulletins or transmissions necessary to provide MCOMs or emergency communications. What type of international communications is an FCC licensed amateur radio station permitted to make? The answer is communications incidental to the purpose of the amateur radio service and remarks of a personal character. Right? So that is what hams are able to do. That's what you're allowed to do. All right, so let us end there because that is where we stopped in respect of the slide deck. So we have nicely completed that slide deck. And we also completed the questions in the question pool. So team, I believe we only have one more teaching session left given the amount of content that we have to cover. All right. So our next class will be held next Friday, God's willing, and that will be September the 18th. September the 18th of September, right? That's Friday, 18th of September, same time, 8:30 p.m. I would like to wish everyone all the best. Encourage you to continue taking those online practice exams. Perhaps at our next session, we'll talk a bit about the opportunity for taking the real exam online. And do enjoy the rest of the evening. Do have a great weekend and a great week ahead. Do look forward to joining you next week, Friday. So everyone, continue to be safe and all the best.